Coming up, the New York Football Giants have officially played their first preseason game, taking on the Detroit Lions. What did we love from Eric Gray in the running back room? Standouts on the defensive side from the front to the linebacking core. But still, plenty of questions, of course, as we are in the early days of preseason football. We dive in and break it all down coming up next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we are elated to be able to talk about real snaps, real football for the New York Football Giants, even if it's in preseason. Although I will acknowledge, Andy, I think we maybe would agree we would have just as soon wanted to have seen televised joint practices over the preseason game we watched last night.
Yeah, we obviously got to see some camp battles and some players that are competing for roster spots in week one of the preseason. Whereas,
And some starters.
Yeah, well, and some starters or people that thought that they were starting, right?
That's right.
I mean, there's a couple of those, but yeah, the Lions joint practices with the Giants. Obviously, you had more of the starters. You had Daniel Jones, you had the Darius Slaytons, you had a lot of the players, even Brian Burns, Dexter Lawrence, etc. They sat off to the side and took a little bit of a break while some of the other players who are vying for backup spots or fringe 53-man roster positions were really battling it out. And I think, we'll get into some highlights, some kind of questions that we can bat around about what we saw out there, and then obviously get into what that means moving forward in the preseason.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we got a few more weeks, obviously, of summer and a few more weeks before the official start of the season in the beginning of September. So these are narratives we're building that we'll continue to watch week over week, and they're going to shift a little bit. Starting, though, I mean, right off the bat, man, there's a lot of key figures here, and some guys have been getting some more buzz in camp, like Dyontae Johnson, who we'll talk about. A guy that wasn't really getting buzz or was almost being talked about as like the forgotten man was Eric Gray in this backfield. And I got to tell you, and as everyone would agree, when you watched him last night, it had some of the early samples when it comes to between the tackles and north and south running behind, as we'll talk about, an interesting patchwork, offensive line. He thought, yeah, this is the problem. He's just not quite explosive enough. He's not quite quick enough. And then you get like this signature moment for him. And he had two of them in the running game and then also in the passing game. But boy, when he takes that run, goes between the tackles, cuts to the outside, and then gives that just devastating shoulder dip that gets a cornerback anytime that you are seeing the face of the defender when you're watching the camera from the end zone, you know that he's made a massive mistake, scoots for a big touchdown, catches a little over the top pass down the left sideline from Tommy DeVitto in the game. Like, this was a really important, I think, first game for Eric Gray. Goes 4 carries, 52 yards, like minimal carries, but also catches 4 passes for 46, has the 2 touchdowns. Critical, I think, for him to have this type of like combined performance running and receiving going forward inside of that running back room.
Adam, hand up. In my mind, I have already written off Eric Gray on this team as a contributor throughout the preseason, just with all the moves the Giants made with Tyrone, Tracy. My affinity for Turbo Miller. I think that he has a real shot to make the roster, but we can get into that in a minute too.
Yeah.
And I kind of wrote off Eric Gray because it was just a disaster rookie season for him. He wasn't necessarily healthy. He didn't look very explosive when he ran the ball last season. The disaster that they tried to do with special teams, having him return punts and kicks, was a mess. You could tell that he just got completely discombobulated last season in terms of like what his role was going to be. And so for me, going into this offseason, I kind of had the target on his back saying he needs to contribute to be able to make this roster. And the early returns are unbelievable. I mean, you mentioned that cut that he made. That is an elite running back level cut. He's one-on-one, and there is a very specific type of running back that has the ability one-on-one to just make people miss. And that was a make-miss move by Eric Gray. It was awesome. You mentioned his ability to catch the ball out of the backfield. That throw from Tommy DeVitto was great. The catch was great. And it's a 25-yard gain right out of the gate. You have to be impressed with Eric Gray. The second touchdown was a 1-yard run where the offensive line, the backup offensive line,
actually did
the entire Lions team into the end zone. Like, I think you probably could have run it in, or I could have run it in. But credit where credit's due. Eric Gray looked great. He's clearly the highlight, scored the only 2 touchdowns of the game, and he was the reason why the Giants won.
Yeah, it's a really good performance from him. And then it does expand to the overall running back room. And it'll be fascinating to watch because going back to last year, he's the only guy when we talk about Turbo Miller, we talk about Tyrone Tracy Jr. He's the only guy we have a sample size from from last season to say, right, like, boy, getting guys out in space, giving them an opportunity to operate, like this kind of matters. And then we also know you're going up against backups and different levels of competition. Okay, fine. But overall, in this running back room, it turns over in a big way. You mentioned Dante Miller. Turbo gets 12 carries, 63 yards. We won't have to go a mile deep on him. We're going to talk about all of these guys we need to go forward. But the biggest takeaway was obviously that speed, that burst. And you could tell, oh, this is a guy that can get to the edge. And that's what matters most here. He can string out any defender all the way, get that edge, and then start to get upfield with real burst. So you got the sample size. Tyrone Tracy Jr. mixed in there, a little bit of both. Like that was, I think it's hard to get the sexiest sample size on him until you get maybe the starters next week and he gets mixed in. But really, overall, this running back room showcased, hey, young, versatile, like, and putting together a nice complementary set of players behind Devin Singletary.
Yeah, Tyrone Tracy looked good in his limited snaps. You can tell that they probably when the playbook gets a little bit more expanded, they're going to have more looks for him because he can
Yeah.
kind of do a lot out there. You mentioned Turbo Miller. Obviously, I have an affinity for him. I really think he's got a legitimate shot because if you can do one thing better than almost anybody else on the roster, like that gives you an opportunity to really solidify a position. Adam, you can see it. If he gets out in space, he is going to be impossible to take down. You saw it on one of the plays where like some guy just got him by like the leg or the knee, or else you felt like he was gone 80
Yeah.
yards down the field. And so in this running back room, you got to be encouraged or excited. The Giants signed Motor Singletary as the primary replacement for Saquon Barkley in terms of doing the grunt work, probably going to get all the dirty, grimy yards, in the middle, 4 yards of carry type stuff. But the explosiveness that Saquon Barkley provided, you saw it from Eric Gray. You saw it from Turbo Miller, and you see the versatility of Tyrone Tracy. If you were very upset about Saquon Barkley not being on this roster, after one
Good
preseason game,
night.
you have
Yeah,
to
yeah,
be
yeah.
slightly encouraged at how this room is starting to shape up.
And let me also just mention too, 5 carries, 26 yards for Tyrone Tracy Jr. in this game. You can see like at 5'11, 210, obviously he's the converted wide receiver, but there was something really nice about the way that he played physically into contact in those reps that he got there. So all things to watch for in this running back room. Obviously, it was about 26, 25% of the snaps for both Miller and for Eric Gray. Eric Gray, again, did damage and limited, and then actually a lot more snaps for Tyrone Tracy Jr., something I think they like about the idea of him being in the backfield and helping with some of the pass blocking work. Although I will note that he did have a little bit, a notable whiff early on in this game, all things to learn from and grow from. Okay. We want to continue to go with our positive list here before we flip the script over, and we'll just talk about areas to watch. There's not really negatives coming out of the gate. I think in preseason game number 1, it's just, okay, let's all keep an eye on this going forward. Defensive side of the ball, you heard about Dyontae Johnson in camp. Oh, he's really showing up. He looks pretty good. Well, guess what? He looks pretty darn good. On the defensive side of the ball in this game, he comes in. Obviously, you're not playing those starters. Opportunity here to showcase that the proof of the week is in the pudding on game day. He looked phenomenal, man. Like he looks every bit the part of being a high level. And again, knowing that you're playing against backups as well, but that is a very solid looking backup linebacker for this core. And it's great if he kind of comes out of nowhere after being here last year and actually carves out a role for himself. Really impressed with how he looked, ranging out, getting to the sidelines, working in between the tackles, and getting after the quarterback as well.
Adam, 4 total tackles, 2 solo tackles, a sack, 2 tackles for a loss, and a QB hit. He was all over the place. Like,
Yeah.
it's one of those things where we talked about it before. We were concerned about the inside linebacking depth for the Giants behind Bobby Okereke, behind Micah McFadden, who's been slow with a little bit of injuries early in camp. That was one of our big concerns.
Yeah.
If Dyontae Johnson needed just a scheme change from Wink Martindale to Shane Bowen to look like this, then you have to be excited about what he's showing. We don't want to overhype it, as you mentioned, because it is against backups and it's just been a small sample size in training camp in this game. But if this is the type of play that we can get from Dyontae Johnson, then the Giants have found a guy that can be a rotational backup guy that can come in and contribute. He was awesome. And it wasn't just that he accumulated stats. It was like when you saw him tackle someone in the backfield or he made a hit, you're like, whoa, who is that? And he gets up and you're like, oh, that was Dyontae Johnson again, right? Like it was, to me, it was like the eye test was showing me that
Yeah.
he was surveying the field. He was the guy that was getting in the mix. I was very encouraged by what I saw from Dyontae Johnson. How could you not be? He was definitely the best defensive player, I think, for the Giants last night.
No, and again, in the same way on the offensive side with Eric Gray, it's 24 snaps, it's 34% of the defensive snaps, and he showcases the value that he can bring to the team. And that's the best version of him. He got a little bit dinged up. Like, we'll get any information about it. We'll talk about any other injuries, obviously, coming out of this game as well. But when a player pops that much and also isn't on the field necessarily for a large portion of the game, you can try to take away that and feel like it's even stronger. And if we want to expand it out as we did with the running backs, inside of this linebacker room, there's another few notable names coming out of this game. I'm going to jump to the immediate one that you know I'm going to go to, and that's Darian Beavers. It's later in the game. You know, it's his third string, back end of this game here, but he looked healthy. He looked instinctual. He made some really good plays. He got in on run stops. Like, all I wanted to see from him is that he's out there and contributing and looking like he's healthy. Because a year ago, he did not. And it started to make me question the way we looked at him coming as a prospect and saying, well, he had a couple of nice tackles and one signature play, I thought, from a health and fit standpoint. He went from the middle of the field almost over to the left side, got all the way across to the right side and closed the gap on a run play out to the edge. That tells me that, okay, the instincts, the burst, and the closing speed is there for him. I won't go any longer on him because, I know what it represents, but he fell into this category with other several linebackers who played a lot of special teams reps. But hey, okay, like, let's start to continue to build this sample size and maybe get the fan base excited that the answers for the linebacker room are already here.
Yeah. So Darian Beavers, obviously, you can only compete against the people that are on the field against you. So it's no knock on
Yeah,
him that
right.
he's in there in the fourth quarter against other guys that are fringe roster guys for the Lions, but he played well. Like, and so the progression in the preseason is like, okay, can we bring him in the second quarter and he can contribute against second
Right.
string guys instead of like back of the rotation guys? But you can't deduct points from Darian Beavers just because that was who was on the field. So for me, I agree with you. I think that he looked good. He led all Giants in tackles with 5 tackles. He had 1 tackle for loss. That was great. The one other guy I wanted to highlight on the defense that I thought played well that stood out to me
Mm.
was Boogie Basham. I thought
Yeah,
that
yeah.
he,
Yep.
again, he's going against second string. He himself is a second string guy. So he's competing against other guys of his ilk. And Adam, I thought that he played well. He had 4 total tackles, 2 solo tackles. He had the sack in the backfield. He had a tackle for loss. He had a quarterback hit. He also deflected 2 passes. When he knew he wasn't getting home on the quarterback, he put his hands up to be able to block some of the passing lanes. I thought he showed a real intelligence and acumen
Mhm.
at the position that I haven't actually seen from Boogie Basham. We heard about a lot of this coming from Buffalo that, Daboll and Shane had familiarity with him. I had not seen any of these types of moves or capabilities from Boogie Basham. I was pleasantly surprised with how he played. I would like to see more of that moving forward.
Yeah, I really thought that some of those key names inside of that linebacker room really stood out. And you can even say you want to put the rookie in there and Muasau. I thought that he just played well, right? Nose for the football. He's small, but boy, does he know how to carve through some lanes. And I think it was Carl Banks that mentioned on the broadcast. I just haven't seen those type of players in the linebacker room for the Giants in recent years. Not necessarily the right measurables, but just knows how to go out and play football and plays faster on the field than maybe he does on tape or by the measurables. So it was a really positive for this group overall. The other 2 guys I'll just mention in this because they were on the field a lot and they made some big plays. And Andy correctly mentioned before we started snap counts being interesting in all of this. You obviously have Adams and you have Whitley. Now, Whitley gives you kind of, he has one bad play, but a lot of positives. I thought he did a great job dipping his shoulder once Sudfeld came back in for Detroit, got around the edge, very disruptive player. But I make the note, and I mean this positively, that he played 77% of the special team snaps as well. So you probably look at him as being that type of player. That's where he's trying to make a name for himself. Same thing with Adams. Yes, do I like some of the plays that he made? 100%. But can I envision him being a little bit too stiff and a little bit too slow when it comes to playing the number ones on game day in September? Of course I can. But still, it's a good sample size. Like you mentioned with Beavers, I can only play the guys that are in front of me. And these guys, as the game progressed, started to look better. So I think they're somewhere between being, edge of the roster guys and maybe some opportunity for special teams and backup value as well. Only other note that I want to make sure we make here when it comes to the defensive side of the ball is that I thought overall the defensive front played very well in this game. And again, when we talk about depth and where are we going to see the players step up here, a lot of guys looked the part with no Dexter Lawrence on the field. There was a handful of players that I think really played and performed well for themselves. And I'll actually go deep cut here. We can go Chapman. I think he did look good. I'm going to go with Rodgers. This weird converted, bulked up former lacrosse player. He has that kind of build and the length. Like you're just like, oh, okay. If this kid is still learning a little bit about how to maximize what he is, that's a nice young raw talent playing late in this game.
I couldn't agree more. Obviously, I've highlighted Casey Rogers as a guy that could make the
Yes.
roster. Elijah Chapman, while he was in there, he got a sack that was like a high motor, high energy move. You mentioned Whitley. The one thing that stuck out of my mind is like energy burst. Like when he was on the field, he made a couple of mistakes. Obviously, the big mistake that he made early on, but like it felt like he was going 100 miles an hour, like taking every chance that he could with this opportunity. The last thing I will say in a positive note is, and this is more like overarching about the defense, I felt like a little bit more calm with Shane Bowen as the defensive coordinator. Like when you hang
Why? Because he was just casually walking up and down the field, looking at his clipboard, calling plays and communicating and not getting red as a strawberry.
Yeah, well, yes, that and like he's like, we're gonna stop the run. We're gonna stop the run. We're gonna make it difficult. And while Nate Sudfeld did not look great, and the Lions, first string that was playing didn't look great. They didn't have a first down until like 5 possessions in or whatever it was. It just felt like the Giants' identity is we don't need to throw a bunch of people at you. Our defensive front is going to stop the run, and we're going to challenge our edge rushers to be able to win one-on-one and get to the quarterback. And you're like, I see it. I already see it, and I'm liking what I'm seeing.
All right, coming up here in a second, we are, of course, are going to talk about the quarterback room, talk about Drew Lock, a little bit of an injury scare there, how Tommy DeVitto looked, the offensive line. But in a moment, the most concerning thing that I saw coming out of this game, and we'll get into that in just one moment. All right, we remind you as you watch us over on YouTube or absorb us on the podcast feed that today's episode is brought to you by Pietential, Pietential. That's Pietential.com. It is a free for individual users online assessment tool that sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve, and tracks your progress over time. Everybody wants to be the best version of themselves. Go and check out all the great features over on Pietential.com. Andy, before we talk, I'm going to put this out there because if there was a hill that Andy was dying on and it felt like, this isn't a great look, and by the way, Ryder Anderson had an hand injury in this game. So things happen fast. Boy, I got to tell you, Azeez Ojulari, he might as well have been a dead fish. And I'm not going to make any global statements about it. It just didn't look good for a guy who has been obviously downgraded behind Brian Burns now in the pecking order. He should have looked like a game wrecker, at least for a handful of plays. And my most disappointing part about what I saw from him was that it just seemed like he was going through the motions. And I wonder how much of a mental game is happening there around who he is, what he thinks his pedigree is. And, and maybe I'm reading way too much into it, but that was just every time I saw 51, I thought, like I'm not zeroed in on him. I'm just noticing that he was on the field and somebody else was making the play. I'm probably going a mile deep here.
No. So Adam, I thought you were going to say the worst part about what I saw was that Andy is right. I thought that's what you were going to start with. Like,
buddy, but come on, we're not a podcast like that.
I have felt this way about the performance of Azeez Ojulari, and I have been just chastised. I have been vilified by everyone being like, "You're crazy about this take."
Did you feel some nerves about having that take and feeling like, you know what I mean? In the back of your mind, you're going,
of course,
maybe I overcommitted. Maybe I've overcommitted.
Well, because in camp, they're like, wow, Azeez Ojulari had 2 sacks this day. He's ready to come back. And he's in a contract year, which players sometimes miraculously end up having their best seasons in contract years. But Adam, when I watched that game, I was like, this is the perfect opportunity for Azeez Ojulari to go in there and impose his will on second string offensive linemen, right? That was the first thing I thought about. And
50% of the defensive snaps, too. He played 35 snaps in this game.
He played 50% of the defensive snaps for the Giants, and it may as well have been 0. You did not see him do anything. And I'm gonna say it right now. Boogie Basham looks way better than Azeez Ojulari does, right? I mean, I know you can't
guy fighting for a job. Yeah. No.
I know you can't just go off of one game, but this is what concerns me is if Azeez Ojulari can't handle like being like he is one of the more accomplished guys. He had 8
Yes.
sacks his rookie season. He should be dominating some of these backup guys. How is Chapman getting sacks? How is Boogie Basham getting sacks? How are all these guys getting in the backfield? And Azeez Ojulari was non-existent there. I'm curious to see how they handle his snap count in the preseason. Like, my last question on this, because I know that we're overworking it just because I have this hill that I'm dying on this point, Adam. But watching that, what is your concern meter on Azeez Ojulari? Because before it was probably a 2. Out of 10 right now, does it move to a 4? Are you like, okay, like he's got to do something in the next 2 games or else? Or are you like, his roster spot is fine, he's okay, like we're okay, let's get to regular season week 1?
I'll move him to a 3 right now, and then I'll know it by how many reps he plays next week. And I mean that kind of in a, the more reps that he plays is maybe the more concerning, because it means that the role is more in question. And then the more reps he plays, is he showing something in those reps that he's on the field for? So, and again, I still stop myself short of being a guy where he's a cut candidate, but it just wasn't great. It was the bad look for a guy who clearly, again, even for yourself, you're in a contract here, man, for your own, future prospects, you need to come out and really show up and show out. We will talk about him more, obviously, because it's position battles, depth chart, reps, all that stuff. However, it will be interesting, by the way, to see him if he plays with some of the starters next week as well and has complementary pieces around him. Let's stay focused back in on the offensive line here, though, because this obviously, we've already said, starting line, okay, you make these moves in the offseason, you bring in 3 new starters effectively now in the offensive line as we see it being projected. But in a game like this, you're getting a look at a lot of the other backup pieces. And it seems unfortunate that Ezeudu does not look great playing at left tackle. It seems like they're trying to force him maybe into an opportunity, which it stinks, because sometimes it feels like overexposure can now end up downgrading him even more than he should be. Another draft pick, when we just talk about this, in McCathan, he's buried in this whole situation. He comes in for some guard reps, but he does not look like he's anywhere near being a contributor. Who were the guys? Let's talk positive first. Who were the guys that stood out to you? Miles gets tackle reps. Schlottman came in. He was playing there at center. Anybody jump out to you as being as a player that seems to maybe have a clear path to what his role is going to be from a depth perspective?
Yeah, well, Morrissey at center had 26 reps. He played 45% of the snaps. Like, he's the backup center, or Schlottman. You can take your pick between the two of them. They both played. They both looked fine, in my opinion. I didn't see the pressure coming directly at Tommy DeVito's face or Drew Lock's face. So, like, that made me feel a little better, considering we haven't heard about either of them with John Michael Schmitz out. We've heard more about Greg Van Roten getting signed and starting immediately at center during the joint practices than we've heard.
Very relieved that Van Roten wasn't out there for, for reps in this game. That would have been, you would have said, what do we do? Hold on. Come on now, people. So it was good to see that as well.
Yes. So the offensive line was interesting in that regard. Listen, the offensive line was okay. I thought it was fine. Jalen Mayfield was out there. There was a couple other guys that
Juice was out there getting some tackle reps too.
Yep, exactly. But my biggest concern, you mentioned Ezeudu. I'm just thinking in the back of my mind, do we have a swing tackle on this roster? Because clearly Ezeudu can't handle those duties, right? Like, it seems like it's too much for him right now. I don't know. I can't project if he's ever going to be a swing tackle or a starting caliber player, but right now the moment's too big. He was going up against second strings and he was getting beat a few different times. You have him, you have Kajust, and you have Evan Neal. And if you're saying, like, can any of them be the right tackle for Illuminor if he goes down for a game or a few snaps? Can any of them be left tackle if, heaven forbid, Andrew Thomas isn't available? It feels like the swing tackle might not be on this roster right now.
Yeah, I would have to say so. And remember, like, Ezeudu was drafted as a guard. Like, it's like, so this positional change for him is with this, it's like, it just feels like, okay, because you brought in veterans to start and then you wanted to make sure that you secured it. We've heard Joe Shane talked about on the broadcast when he came in. We wanted to fix that, secure it, build it, bring in depth. And now it just feels like you're trying to maybe move him because Evan Neal is injured and has struggled. You're like, okay, maybe Ezeudu can find a role for himself out there, and it just keeps pushing you out of rep opportunities.
Well, the one thing I will say is Joshua Ezeudu played guard, projected as a guard, but the Giants drafted him with the idea that they felt with his traits and his skills that he could become a tackle. It's why they went up and got him as high as they did. That clearly has not worked out. So whatever they saw about the translation of how he could play outside really hasn't been successful. If the Giants knew this, does he go in the mid rounds the way that they thought he was? They thought he could be a tackle. Clearly, it's just too much for him now. we'll have to see if they're still, because the depth is so thin at tackle, he still may make the roster as one of these like rotational pieces, but you got to have concern about anything behind Illuminor and Andrew Thomas right now.
Roar the Lions UK pod, I talked to Anthony from over there, talked about Dan Skipper, a guy that he just he glossed over him. He's like, we have, our starters, and if something really goes wrong, they have young players that they want to develop. He maybe is a cut candidate, and he may not be sexy, but he'd be a guy that right now, if you look at the Giants tackle room, you'd say, well, I'll bring in a body. Like, I'll bring in a veteran body who has a lot of starts under his belt, certainly. So then behind the offensive line is wow, I don't stop myself short. I was going to say the most interesting part of this conversation. It's clearly not, but it is interesting. Drew Lock comes in, obviously, this offseason. We saw on Hard Knocks, the Giants were like, we're bringing back Tyrod Taylor. We want that veteran in the room. We like him. Whoa, that's a hefty price tag. Okay, moving on. When you pivot to Drew Lock, listen, to compare him to Tyrod Taylor, I don't know if that's worthwhile or not. He comes in behind backup offensive linemen, guys that are trying to figure out their roles, and he just kind of looks, rough. But he's just getting here, right? He's just in camp. Tommy DeVitto comes in, and I think you see the contrast, which Brian Daboll mentioned. It's night and day from last year to this year. His understanding of the offense, communicating that. He even said in preseason games, more often than not, Tommy DeVitto is going to be the guy out there on the field that is telling players where they need to line up. So you do get this contrast, and then obviously the minor injury to Drew Lock, they say he'll be fine. Do you take anything away from that? Do you put any stock in this when it comes to what the QB room looks like beyond saying, hey, our backup offensive line needs help, and Tommy DeVitto is already in rhythm when it comes to this system?
Oh, this is a tough one.
Andy. Hold on, fresh hill? Is there the Azeez Ojulari hill you die on, and now a small mound building where Tommy DeVitto is the backup quarterback?
No, well, I'm not going to go that far yet,
All
but
right, I'm trying to help you out.
I had my concerns when Drew Lock signed with the Giants. I thought the contract that he was given of $5 million for Drew Lock with $4.95 million guaranteed was a bit of a concern for me because it felt like the Giants were like, he's going to be our backup no matter what. The money's talking. Like, nothing that we do can change the fact that he is going to be solidified there. And then you watch this game, and like, I know that the offensive line was bad, but the offensive line...
Did the 8.3 rating not move you, Andy?
I mean, the offensive line was bad, but it was also bad for Tommy DeVitto. And Tommy DeVitto, I saw Connor Hughes, who is a media person for SNY. He said something that I agree with wholeheartedly. It's like, sometimes when you see a guy get on the field at quarterback, you look and you're like, that ain't it. Like, that's just not the guy. And with Tommy DeVitto, you're like, oh, no, he's not like overwhelmed. Like, I don't feel like he's a deer in the headlights. Like, he can make good throws. He can be relatively accurate if he's given time. So, like, I'm not concerned about Tommy DeVitto. But if you're telling me that Drew Lock is just automatically the backup quarterback because of the money, and he continues to play like this in the preseason, like, that to me is the tough part about this, is because clearly Tommy DeVitto was better than Drew Lock was in this game. If it happens again in the game 2 and again in game 3, like, the only thing that this fully solidified for me is there's no way the Giants can let Tommy DeVitto go out and get released and have a chance to be claimed by another team.
Oh, no.
They have to carry 3 quarterbacks right now. With Daniel Jones's injury history, with Drew Lock looking as inconsistent as he has, and Tommy DeVitto knowing the system, Tommy DeVitto may have just secured himself a roster spot with the Giants after all these question marks about, like, are they going to keep him? Will he go to the practice squad? Like, to me, that's gone out the window. He is now entrenched as the QB3.
And the notable that Drew Lock has looked a little bit, he's had up and down days in camp as well throughout. The big limitation for Tommy DeVitto, and we understand the context we're talking about this in. The big limitation is that he doesn't have a big arm. And that's actually, I think, like the number one trait of Drew Lock that they like bringing him in is we're going vertical. Grip it and rip it like Daniel Jones. We got to get vertical, right? So when Tommy DeVitto comes into a game, it does look good, by the way. And I liked this game, and I hope we see this again and again from him in the preseason because it's just a great story. And it's great to say, hey, we found an undrafted, free agent quarterback, and he gives us depth and he gives us some value for our team. But how deep these routes get run and how far you can push it, that's the biggest limitation in terms of what the Giants want to do. But we'll continue to have that conversation. Let's not close out, though, before we discuss the secondary here, because Andy and I Andy, you can start this off when it comes to who you saw on the field or who you didn't. Notable, I just think that Gervarius Owens had a couple of nice plays in here for himself. I think that looked pretty good. Tyler Nubin got his feet wet. Obviously, he had the injuries in the beginning of camp, so that's good for him as well. But you have a concern when it comes to the cornerback room and who was or was not on the field.
Yeah, it was just a little. I was a little puzzled with how they ended up doing some of the reps, and I'm trying not to read into it too much.
Mm-hmm.
But what I will say is, we saw Drew Phillips for seven snaps. He got in the backfield, laid the hit on a running back for a tackle for loss, and I was like, "Yep, I've seen everything I need to see from him. You can go now to the bench, and you can go take a shower, get a Gatorade, like do whatever you need to do. I am happy with what I saw. Obviously, he's a rookie; he needs to get reps. Cordell Flott was not available. He had a minor injury. They said he should be back for practices and potentially playing in the next game. I was just surprised that we didn't see any of Nick McLeod. Like, they obviously rested some of the big starters on defense, like Dexter Lawrence, Brian Burns, Kayvon Thibodeau, Jason Pinnock. Like, there were guys that you're like, you know what? Take a seat. You're key contributors in all this. The fact that Nick McLeod is already in that group or he's not in that group, like, I don't understand why when you're debating whether or not he's going to be a nickel corner or an outside corner, how is he not getting any reps at all in this game?
Because he's already an established player on this roster to me. Like, and that doesn't mean that he's a starter or that he's plug and play wherever it may be. But you mentioned, okay, it's Drew Phillips. Well, where's Darnay Holmes in this equation? Who's the backup at the nickel spot? It could very well be Nick McLeod. Now, Cordell Flott, he has the injury. He wasn't going to play in this game. But if you turn around and say, okay, how do we feel about the outside corner position? You saw some reps. I mean, listen, Trey Herndon got out there on the field. I can't tell whether or not that was an amazing instinctual coverage interception or that he kind of got turned around and then kind of accidentally ran into the pick, then fumbled it later. He just, again, I can't figure out which way to go with him about if he's a veteran camp body or if he could carve out a role for himself. But to me, it's just Nick McLeod has been here. They know what he is. Do I think that they'd like to have Cordell Flott be the starting outside corner? Of course. And they want Drew Phillips to be the starter. It looks like he's going to claim that role. But Nick McLeod represents the security blanket. And I said this before we were getting started. My comp would be, why isn't Darius Slayton playing? Why did Jalen Hyatt go out there for some reps? Well, because Darius Slayton's a security blanket. Do we want Jalen Hyatt to be the starter? Sure, of course we do. But we want to make sure we protect the asset in behind him. That's where I stand on it. I maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I just don't think that Nick McLeod has much to gain or lose in the eyes of the coaching staff when it comes to some of these preseason games, especially the first one. We'll watch next week when we start talking starters and is Cordell Flott ready to go or not.
Well, and the challenge that I have, and that's why I'm just more puzzled or like miffed by like the strategy of who sat and who didn't on certain players. But like Cordell Flott was injured. So Adam, my question is, if he was not nicked up, does Cordell Flott get out there and start in this game?
No, and that is a good question. Yeah, that would be a very interesting question, right? Then you're asking this thing, and maybe that would be, but that's the Darius Slayton to Jalen Hyatt. If Cordell Flott's healthy, then maybe it is Cordell Flott. You go out there, get your reps. Let's see what you look like. And Nick McLeod is there as the veteran security blanket.
It was the 2022 draft that Cordell Flott was drafted in. Like, how many years can he be on the roster before you're like, either we know he's a known commodity or not? It's very similar to Nick McLeod. I mean, I know Cordell Flott is significantly younger. He was one of the youngest guys drafted by the Giants when he was drafted. I think he was 20 years old when the Giants drafted him. So Nick McLeod, I think, is 25 or 26. So he's a little bit older, more established. But yeah, it was just fascinating to me. It made me think, if Cordell Flott wasn't injured, he's probably starting instead of Trey Hawkins or instead of Darnay Holmes or instead of Trey Herndon or whoever it is. And Nick McLeod has already solidified himself as a key contributor, however you want to categorize like what his position is going to be. He's valuable enough where they didn't want to waste him in week one of the preseason.
Of course, 28 total tackles, 3 forced fumbles, an interception, and 312 total snaps a year ago, right? So there's experience there. And maybe, and again, we said this in the offseason, Cordell Flott, like, what's the conversation? What are we trying to figure out here? Well, remember, go back to the draft. The Giants maybe had a different number one route of how they came out of this offseason. Maybe they went to 1A when they end up and landing, a great talent in Tyler Nubin and changing kind of the perspective of how we look at it. I think, again, next week when we talk about starters getting out there for reps, that's when we'll start to dissect maybe where some of these guys stand. But it's a good reminder, man, these joint practices, the sessions alone with the team, That's where you're figuring a lot of this stuff out, because you see it, man. The first quarter and a half of this game last night was as vanilla and blasé. And by the way, whatever you saw from the offensive line, remember, Brian Dable came out and he's like, we're not doing motions. We're not getting crazy. This is straightforward football. Set the guys up. We want to keep it simple and try to build out of that. And I think that that's also a healthy approach. I wonder if they're taking that in terms of reps and who goes where. Last note that I just want to make as we get out the door, a reminder that we did see a converted quarterback to tight end out there in Mr. Jackson, who had some nice plays, had some missed opportunities, but he's a fun guy to watch. There's always a guy, right? There's always a guy in preseason you get excited about. He's been interesting just to watch there. He's obviously a big body, and just trying to think about probably practice squad, project developmental player, but you're always going to get a few of those guys. Was there anybody on either side of the ball that you said, oh, let's keep an eye on how he looks over the next year or two?
No, he got a ton of work, and he was someone that I was interested in because he is a converted quarterback from the University of Buffalo. Like I vividly remember him in college. He's making the transition. I'm also, I know this sounds crazy, but I thought to myself, I'm like, if he's on the practice squad and like he's also in camp, like could he be, if he's on the roster, could he be the emergency quarterback if something goes wrong? Maybe he could play like wildcat or throw the ball, considering he just played quarterback. Like, there's those little dynamics that you think about, if Tommy DeVitto is going to be on the roster or not, if who can play quarterback if someone gets hurt. There's always like those capabilities. Tyree Jackson definitely got a workout. He was someone that was running routes all over the place for good and for bad. A couple drop balls, a couple bad angles at certain things, but then he had a couple big plays, almost scored a touchdown where Eric Gray ran it in for a 1-yard run. Yeah, I had the same thought that you did about him as well.
That being the case, guys, at the end of the day, it's only preseason game number 1. Still a long way to go here, obviously, for the New York Football Giants. We're going to talk about special teams, talk about his position battles. Rough one to really get a good sample size on the depth of the wide receiver position and who looked good or who didn't. A lot of Drew Lock passes that just kind of went different places. A lot of Tommy DeVitto looking over and maybe saying, that's not where that route's supposed to be, my friends, for us to maybe get a better look. So there's going to be a lot of positions, I think, that we'll start to dial in more on starting next week as we look ahead to Houston and preseason game number 2. But in the meantime, as we always say, over on YouTube, you get into it. We're going to have at least one live episode each and every week. We're breaking down past footage. We did a crossover, a little bit more of a unique one. Going to try to get a Houston setup here where we really preview matchups. Some fans did not appreciate the negative slant that I had towards the New York Football Giants. We're a developing team. We need that. But getting those comments, get us on the podcast feed, wherever you get those needs fulfilled as well. And please check out our sponsors, Potential and Persona. But until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.